Commander Jake Bennett stared out the viewport of the Frontier Dawn as the blue and green planet grew larger against the black canvas of space. After 6 months of travel, they were finally approaching Haven 7, the world that would become humanity's first deep space colony. Behind him, 30 crew members prepared for landing, their excitement filling the corridors with nervous chatter and laughter. Jake smiled, feeling proud of what they were about to accomplish. The mission had been a gift from the Galactic Coalition, the powerful alliance of alien species that humanity had joined 10 years ago. After making first contact, Earth had been welcomed as a junior member, given access to advanced technology and promised support in expanding across the stars. Haven 7 was supposed to be proof of that partnership, a beautiful world with breathable air and abundant resources, perfect for human settlement. Dr. Amy Rodriguez walked onto the bridge, tablet in hand, her brown eyes focused on the data streaming across the screen. She was the mission's chief science officer, responsible for analyzing everything about their new home. Jake had worked with her for 5 years and trusted her instincts completely. "Something is wrong," Amy said without greeting. Her voice was tight with concern. "The atmospheric readings don't match what we were given. The seismic activity is way higher than the surveys indicated. And look at this temperature data. It swings from -20 to +50 degrees in a single-day cycle." Jake frowned and moved to her side, studying the numbers. They made no sense. The original survey data had shown Haven 7 as remarkably stable, with mild temperatures and calm geology. What he was seeing now looked like a completely different planet. Before he could respond, the communications officer called out, "Commander, the Coalition escort ships are breaking formation. They're pulling back to high orbit." Jake's stomach dropped. The escorts were supposed to guide them through the final approach and landing. Their sudden retreat made no sense unless something was very wrong. He moved to the pilot station, ready to give orders to abort the landing sequence. His hand reached for the controls, but nothing responded. "Navigation is locked," the pilot reported, panic creeping into his voice. "We're locked into descent trajectory. I can't override it." Jake tried every emergency protocol he knew. Nothing worked. The ship continued its descent, pulled down by gravity and locked navigation systems. Through the viewport, he could see the planet's surface growing closer. Dark clouds swirled across continents that looked nothing like the peaceful landscapes in the survey images. Lightning flashed through the atmosphere, and he could see massive storm systems covering half the visible surface. "Brace for impact," Jake ordered over the ship-wide intercom. "Everyone to emergency positions. This is going to be rough." The Frontier Dawn hit the atmosphere hard. The ship shook violently as it pushed through layers of turbulent air. Alarms screamed from every console. Jake gripped his chair as the floor tilted at a dangerous angle. Through the chaos, he heard Amy praying quietly beside him. The heat shields glowed red, then white as friction tore at the hull. They broke through the clouds at terminal velocity. Jake caught a glimpse of jagged mountains and twisted forests before the ground rushed up to meet them. The pilot did everything possible to soften the landing, firing reverse thrusters and trying to level out, but it was not enough. The Frontier Dawn hit the surface with a bone-shattering crash that threw Jake against his restraints hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. Metal screamed and tore. The ship skidded across rocky ground, tearing itself apart as it went. Jake heard explosions from the engine section and smelled smoke filling the bridge. Then everything went still and silent except for the hiss of escaping atmosphere and the crackle of small fires throughout the ship. Jake unbuckled with shaking hands and stood on unsteady legs. The bridge was a disaster. Sparks flew from damaged consoles, and one entire wall had been torn open, revealing the alien landscape outside. Amy was alive, blood running from a cut on her forehead, but otherwise functional. The pilot was slumped in his chair, unconscious but breathing. "Damage report," Jake croaked into his radio. "All sections report in." The responses came back slowly. 2 crew members had died on impact, crushed when the cargo bay collapsed. 5 more were seriously injured. The ship's main systems were destroyed beyond any hope of quick repair. Life support was failing, and the hull had multiple breaches. They had maybe an hour before the ship would be completely uninhabitable. Jake ordered everyone to gather whatever supplies they could carry and prepare to evacuate. As the crew scrambled to follow orders, he helped Amy access what was left of the computer systems. She pulled up the sensor logs from their descent, and what she found made Jake's blood run cold. "This isn't Haven 7, Amy whispered. The stellar positioning is wrong. The planet's mass is wrong. Everything is wrong. They sent us somewhere else entirely. Jake pulled up the ship's communications log, searching for any clue about what had happened. Deep in the archived transmissions, he found something that had been flagged as spam and automatically filtered. It was a stray signal from one of the Coalition escort ships, accidentally broadcast on an open channel before they jumped to faster-than-light speed. He played the recording. An alien voice spoke in the trade language that the Coalition used. The words were clinical, emotionless, discussing the human mission as if it were a simple logistics problem. Jake listened with growing horror as the truth became clear. The Coalition had never intended for humans to establish a colony. They viewed humanity as a threat, too aggressive and too quick to develop dangerous technology. But they could not simply attack Earth without risking war with other Coalition members who opposed such direct action. Instead, they had devised a cleaner solution. Send a group of humans to Korvax 9, a death world where the environment itself would do what the Coalition was unwilling to do openly. The voice in the recording continued, listing statistics about previous attempts by other species to survive on Korvax 9. None had lasted more than 3 weeks. The planet's extreme temperature swings, toxic atmosphere, aggressive wildlife, and deadly plant life combined to create conditions that even the hardiest species found impossible to overcome. The Coalition expected all 30 humans to be dead within 14 days. Jake stood frozen, the tablet trembling in his hands. They had been betrayed. Humanity's supposed allies had sent them here to die, to be quietly erased without the mess of open warfare or political complications. No one would ever know the truth. The Coalition would simply report that the colony mission had failed due to unforeseen technical difficulties. Amy read the transcription over his shoulder, her face going pale. Outside the broken hull, Jake could hear strange sounds. Howls and roars that belonged to no creature from Earth echoed across the landscape. The temperature inside the ship was already dropping, as the alien sun set behind the mountains. Night was coming, and with it, dangers they could barely imagine. Jake made a decision. He gathered every surviving crew member and played them the recording. They deserved to know the truth about what had been done to them. Anger and fear filled the cramped space as the reality sank in. Some people cried. Others cursed. A few sat in stunned silence. When the recording ended, Jake spoke. His voice was steady despite the rage burning in his chest. The Coalition sent us here to die. They think we can't survive on this world. They believe that in 2 weeks we'll all be dead, and they can forget we ever existed. He paused, meeting the eyes of each person around him. I say we prove them wrong. We survive, we adapt. We show them that humans don't die just because someone expects us to. We make it through this nightmare, and then we make sure everyone in the galaxy knows what they tried to do to us. The crew looked at each other, fear slowly giving way to determination. They were stranded on a death world, surrounded by dangers they didn't understand, betrayed by those they had trusted. But they were still alive, and they were human. That had to count for something. Outside, the first screams of nocturnal predators split the darkness. The fight for survival was about to begin. The first night on Korvax 9 was a nightmare that Jake would never forget. They had barely finished evacuating the ship when darkness fell like a curtain. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in less than an hour, and frost began forming on every surface. The crew huddled in a makeshift camp near the wreckage, using pieces of hull plating as windbreaks and starting fires with fuel cells from the damaged engines. Then the predators came. They moved through the darkness with terrifying silence, their forms barely visible except for the gleam of eyes that reflected the firelight. Chris Palmer, a former Marine who had signed on as the mission's security officer, was the first to spot them. He shouted a warning just as one of the creatures lunged from the shadows. The attack was fast and brutal. The predator was the size of a large bear but moved like a cat, all coiled muscle and razor-sharp claws. It killed 2 crew members before Chris managed to drive it off with a makeshift spear and burning debris from the ship. But where one predator retreated, others approached, drawn by the smell of blood and the warmth of living bodies. Jake organized the survivors into a defensive circle, everyone armed with whatever they could grab from the wreckage. Metal bars, broken tools, pieces of sharp debris. The crew fought through the night, driving off attack after attack. By the time the alien sun rose, they were exhausted, terrified and down to 28 people. The 2 killed in the crash and the 2 taken by predators were laid out beneath salvaged sheets, a grim reminder of how quickly death could come on this world. With daylight came new challenges. The temperature soared as the sun climbed higher, quickly reaching levels that made it dangerous to stay in direct sunlight for more than a few minutes. Amy discovered that the air, while breathable, was filled with microscopic spores that irritated the lungs and caused a painful cough. Several crew members developed severe respiratory problems within hours. Jake divided the survivors into teams based on their skills. Amy led the science division, which consisted of 5 people including herself. Their job was to analyze everything about Korvax 9 and find ways to make it survivable. Chris took charge of security with 6 crew members who had military or law enforcement backgrounds. They would defend the camp and eventually explore the surrounding area. Lisa Turner, the chief engineer, gathered 8 people to work on salvaging useful equipment from the Frontier Dawn and building shelter. The remaining crew members were assigned to support roles, gathering resources, tending to the injured, and maintaining the camp. Everyone had a job. Staying busy was the only way to keep panic from setting in. The first week was a lesson in just how hostile Korvax 9 really was. Water was their most immediate problem. They found a stream half a mile from the crash site, but Amy's tests showed it was contaminated with parasites that would cause severe illness or death if consumed. Lisa rigged up a distillation system using parts from the ship, but it could only produce a few liters per day, not nearly enough for 28 people. Food was even worse. Every plant they tested turned out to be either poisonous or indigestible to human biology. Amy worked around the clock, running analysis after analysis, trying to find anything that humans could safely eat. The ship's emergency rations would last maybe 2 weeks if they were very careful. After that, they would starve unless they found an alternative. The predators were a constant threat. They learned quickly that the creatures were territorial and could be somewhat predictable. Chris began mapping their movement patterns, noting which areas they avoided and when they were most active. He taught the crew basic combat techniques, showing them how to move quietly and how to strike at vulnerable points when fighting was unavoidable. On the 8th day, they lost 2 more people. A young technician named Danny Carter went to check one of Lisa's water collectors and was killed by a creature that had been hiding in the vegetation. His partner managed to escape but died later from infected wounds. The mood in camp became darker. They were losing people faster than they could adapt. But humans are stubborn creatures and desperation breeds innovation. Lisa made the first major breakthrough. She discovered that the volcanic vents scattered across the landscape produced consistent geothermal energy. Within 3 days, she had rigged up a basic power grid that could run essential equipment. It wasn't much, but it meant they could keep Amy's lab equipment running and charge the few working communication devices they had salvaged. Chris had his own breakthrough. While studying one of the dead predators, he noticed that its claws were coated in a natural venom that caused paralysis. He carefully harvested the venom sacs and used them to coat the tips of their makeshift weapons. The next time predators attacked, the humans were ready. Even shallow wounds from the poisoned weapons would slow the creatures down, giving the defenders a crucial advantage. Amy's team discovered that while the native plants were inedible, some of them could be processed into useful materials. One species of vine, when dried and woven, created a fabric that was surprisingly strong and heat-resistant. Another plant produced a sap that could be used as a powerful adhesive or, when mixed with fuel, as an accelerant for fires and weapons. By the end of the second week, the survivors had moved beyond simple reaction and began taking proactive steps. They used salvaged metal and local stone to build a more permanent shelter, dug into the side of a small hill for protection from both temperature extremes and predators. They established a watch rotation that ensured someone was always alert and armed. They created a detailed map of the area within a mile of their camp, marking dangerous zones and safe paths. But the cost was high. By day 18, they were down to 24 people. 4 more had died, victims of infection, predator attacks, or accidents in the harsh environment. Each death hit the group hard, but Jake noticed something changing in those who survived. They were becoming harder, more focused, less likely to freeze in panic when danger appeared. The planet was forcing them to evolve or die. On day 22, Amy made the discovery that would save them all. She had been working obsessively on the food problem, barely sleeping, running hundreds of tests on every organic sample she could gather. Late one night, she called Jake to her makeshift laboratory with barely contained excitement in her voice. She showed him a plant that looked like a twisted cross between a mushroom and a cactus. On its own, it was highly toxic, but Amy had discovered that if the plant was combined with enzymes from a local insect, and then heated to a specific temperature, the toxins broke down into compounds that human digestive systems could process. It wasn't pleasant, tasted terrible, and caused stomach cramps, but it was food. Real, sustainable food that could keep them alive. Jake wanted to cry with relief. He hugged Amy tightly, not caring about military protocol or professional boundaries. This discovery meant they could survive past their dwindling emergency rations. It meant they had a future beyond the next few days. The crew held a small celebration that night, their first moment of genuine hope since the crash. They ate the processed plant material, grimacing at the bitter taste but grateful for every bite. Chris raised a cup of distilled water and proposed a toast to the 4 who had died in the past week, promising that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. On day 28, exactly 4 weeks after the crash, Jake stood on a rise overlooking their camp. The Frontier Dawn was a gutted wreck, but around it, they had built something new. A fortified compound with walls made from scrap metal and local stone. A power system that ran consistently. A water supply that was slowly expanding. A food source that, while unpleasant, would keep them alive. And most importantly, 22 survivors who refused to give up. The coalition had given them 2 weeks to die. They had made it to 4 weeks and were getting stronger every day. Jake thought about the recording he had heard. The cold calculation in the alien voice as it predicted human extinction. They had been so certain, so confident that Korvax 9 would do their dirty work for them. But they were wrong. Humans were survivors. They adapted. They improvised. They refused to accept defeat even when the odds were impossible. Jake looked at his crew going about their tasks. No longer the frightened colonists who had crashed here a month ago. They were becoming something else, something harder and more capable. They were becoming people who could not just survive a Deathworld but master it. That night, as Jake lay in his bunk in the new shelter, he made himself a promise. They would survive. They would thrive. And one day they would make sure the entire galaxy knew what the Coalition had tried to do. The humans of Korvax 9 would not die quietly. They would live loud enough for everyone to hear. 6 months had passed since the crash, and the settlement on Korvax 9 looked nothing like the desperate camp they had built in those first terrible weeks. Jake stood at the entrance to what they now called Haven, a fortified compound built into a cliff face that offered natural protection from the largest predators. The humans had learned to use the planet's own geography as a defensive advantage. The cliff provided shelter from the worst of the temperature swings and gave them a commanding view of the surrounding territory. They had carved living spaces into the rock, insulated with materials salvaged from the ship and layered with the heat-resistant fabric Amy's team had developed. Solar collectors lined the cliff top, supplementing Lisa's geothermal power system. Water collectors dotted the area, and they had even managed to establish small growing areas where they cultivated the processed food plants. But the most significant changes were not in the settlement itself. The survivors had transformed. Jake barely recognized the people who walked through Haven compared to the frightened colonists who had fled the Frontier Dawn. They moved with confidence and awareness, always alert but no longer panicked by every sound. Their bodies had adapted to the harsh conditions, becoming leaner and stronger. Their reflexes had sharpened from months of constant danger. They had lost 3 more people over the past months, bringing their numbers down to 19. Each loss was mourned, but the survivors had developed a grim acceptance of the risks they faced daily. They had named landmarks after those who had died. Carter's Creek for the young technician killed in the 2nd week. Rodriguez Ridge for a crew member who had fallen during a hunting expedition. The names served as reminders that they were still alive because others had sacrificed. Amy had become obsessed with understanding Korvax 9 at a molecular level. Her laboratory, carved into the cliff and powered by Lisa's reliable energy grid, was filled with samples and experiments. She spent every waking hour analyzing the native life, searching for ways to make human survival easier. Her latest project was her most ambitious yet. She had been working on something she called the adaptation serum. By combining human genetic material with carefully selected enzymes from native species, she believed she could temporarily modify human digestive systems to process local food more efficiently. It was dangerous, experimental, and probably insane, but after months of testing on tissue samples and running countless simulations, she thought it might work. Jake volunteered to be the first test subject. As commander, he felt it was his responsibility to take the risk before asking anyone else to do so. Amy protested, but he insisted. If something went wrong, the others could learn from his failure. If it worked, it would solve their biggest remaining problem. The processed food kept them alive, but it was barely adequate, leaving everyone in a constant state of mild hunger and nutrient deficiency. The injection hurt more than Jake expected, a burning sensation that spread through his veins and made his stomach cramp painfully. For 3 days he was violently ill, barely able to keep anything down. Amy monitored him constantly, adjusting the serum formula based on his reactions. On the 4th day, the sickness began to fade. On the 5th day, he ate a meal of raw native plant material and felt no ill effects. The serum worked. Not perfectly and not without side effects, but it worked well enough. Over the next month, every survivor received the treatment. Some adapted better than others, and a few experienced complications that Amy had to address, but within 6 weeks, all 19 humans could eat a much wider variety of local food. They were no longer dependent on the processed plant material alone. They could hunt local animals and consume their meat. They could gather and eat various plants directly. For the first time since the crash, genuine food security seemed possible. While Amy revolutionized their diet, Chris had been transforming them into a fighting force. His background as a Marine had given him extensive training in combat and survival, but Korvax 9 demanded entirely new tactics. Earth's military doctrine was useless against creatures that could sense body heat, moved faster than any Earth predator, and attacked with intelligence that suggested pack coordination. Chris developed a combat system specifically for Korvax 9's threats. He taught the crew to move in teams, never alone. He showed them how to use the terrain for ambushes rather than always being on defense. He trained them to recognize the signs of different predator species and how each required different tactics. Most importantly, he taught them to think like hunters rather than prey. The humans began actively hunting the predators that had terrorized them in the early days. They needed the meat for food, but it was more than that. Every successful hunt was a declaration that they refused to be victims. They tracked the nocturnal creatures to their dens and eliminated entire packs. They learned which creatures were territorial and used that knowledge to clear safe zones around Haven. They became so effective that some predator species began avoiding the area entirely. Lisa's engineering work had been equally impressive. She had transformed the wreckage of the Frontier Dawn into a treasure trove of useful technology. Every system that could be salvaged was carefully removed and repurposed. She built water purifiers that could handle the contaminated streams. She created weapons from mining tools and ship components. She even managed to get a few of the ship's sensors working again, giving them early warning of approaching storms or large predator movements. Her greatest achievement came in the 5th month. Using components from the ship's long-range communication array, parts from their personal devices, and materials she had fabricated from scratch, Lisa built a functioning transmitter. It was crude, had limited range, and consumed enormous amounts of power, but it could send signals. They could reach out to the stars again. Jake gathered everyone for a meeting to discuss what they should do with this capability. Some argued they should call for help, broadcast a distress signal and hope that someone other than the Coalition would hear it. Others wanted to stay quiet, fearing that alerting anyone to their survival might bring the Coalition back to finish what they started. Jake listened to all the arguments, but his mind was already made up. They would send a message, but not a plea for rescue. They would send proof that they had survived, that the Coalition's plan had failed. He wanted every species in the galaxy to know that humans had been betrayed and sent to die, but refused to oblige their executioners. They composed the message carefully. It included their location, a brief summary of what had happened, and most importantly, the recording from the Coalition ship that detailed their planned extinction. Jake added a personal note at the end. It simply stated that humanity would remember what was done to them, and that the survivors of Korvax 9 would make sure the galaxy remembered too. Lisa broadcast the message on every frequency she could manage. It repeated continuously, powered by their geothermal generators. There was no way to know if anyone would hear it or if they would care if they did. But it felt important to send it, to declare to the universe that they were still alive and still fighting. Life in Haven settled into a routine. Days were spent hunting, gathering, maintaining the settlement, and continuing to explore the surrounding territory. They discovered caves filled with mineral deposits that Lisa could use for construction. They found areas where the temperature was more stable, which they used for storage. They even discovered evidence of ancient ruins, suggesting that other species had once tried to colonize Korvax 9. Though none had succeeded, evenings were reserved for rest and community. They shared meals around fires, told stories about Earth, and planned for the future. Kevin Walsh, one of the youngest survivors who had worked as a medic, proposed an idea that captured everyone's imagination. Instead of simply surviving until they could escape, why not build something permanent? Why not turn Korvax 9 into a real colony? One that existed not despite the Coalition's betrayal, but because of it. The idea spread through the group like wildfire. They began discussing expansion plans, additional structures, ways to make Haven more than just a survival camp. They talked about bringing more people from Earth eventually, about establishing this Deathworld as humanity's first independent colony. It seemed crazy, but so was everything they had already accomplished. Jake stood at the entrance to Haven late one night, watching the stars above Korvax 9. 6 months ago, he had expected to be dead. They all had. The Coalition had sent them to this planet with the certainty that it would kill them. Instead, they had adapted, evolved, and thrived. They had turned a death sentence into a home. He thought about the message they had sent into space, wondering if it had reached anyone. Part of him hoped it had, that someone out there knew the truth about what the Coalition had done. But another part of him realized it didn't matter. They had already won the only victory that truly counted. They had survived. And in surviving, they had proven that humanity could not be easily erased, not by betrayal, not by a hostile planet, not by anything the galaxy threw at them. The Coalition had tried to make Korvax 9 their grave. Instead, the humans had made it their forge, a place where they were hammered by adversity and came out stronger. Whatever happened next, whatever the future held, Jake knew one thing with absolute. 14 months after the crash, Lisa's early warning sensors detected something that made Jake's blood run cold. Ships were entering orbit around Korvax 9. Multiple vessels moving in formation, taking up positions that suggested they were preparing for landing operations. The Coalition had returned. Jake called an emergency meeting in Haven's main hall, a large chamber carved into the cliff that served as their gathering space. All 19 survivors assembled quickly, their faces showing the same mix of anger and determination that Jake felt. They had known this day might come. The Coalition would eventually want to verify that their plan had worked, that the humans were all dead and the problem was solved. Amy had been monitoring their broadcasts and managed to intercept some of their communications. What she learned was both insulting and useful. The Coalition fleet consisted of 3 survey vessels and 1 light military escort. They were not here for combat. This was supposed to be a simple cleanup mission, salvaging whatever was left of the Frontier Dawn and collecting any data about how quickly the environment had killed the humans. The Coalition crews were discussing the mission casually, treating it as routine work. Some were even complaining about having to visit such a dangerous planet for what they assumed would be a boring salvage operation. Not one of them considered the possibility that humans might still be alive. The idea was so far outside their expectations that they had taken no real precautions. Chris immediately began planning defensive strategies. He wanted to ambush the landing party, take them prisoner, and use them as leverage. But Jake shook his head. Violence would play into the Coalition's narrative that humans were dangerous and aggressive. Instead, Jake had a different plan. They would let the Coalition come, let them see what the humans had built, and then force them to face the consequences of what they had done. The landing party arrived 2 days later. A shuttle descended to the crash site, carrying 6 Coalition personnel led by an officer named Vrix. He was a member of the Thalani species, tall and thin with gray skin and large dark eyes. His team included representatives from 3 other species, all carrying basic survey equipment and showing no signs of expecting danger. They walked through the wreckage of the Frontier Dawn, taking readings and making notes. Fricks was explaining to his team that based on the damage, the humans probably survived the crash but would have died within a week from exposure or predator attacks. He seemed confident, almost bored, as he cataloged the destruction. Then Chris and his security team emerged from concealment. They had been hiding in positions around the crash site, watching and waiting. They were armed with weapons made from ship parts and native materials, their faces hard and their movements coordinated. The Coalition team froze in shock, unable to process what they were seeing. Fricks stared at Chris like he was seeing a ghost. His translator took a moment to engage before he could speak. His voice shook slightly as he asked the obvious question. How were they alive? It had been 14 months. Nothing survived on Corvax 9 for that long. It was impossible. Chris smiled without warmth and gestured for the Coalition team to follow. He led them away from the crash site, along paths that the humans had cleared and marked. The Coalition officers stumbled along, their equipment forgotten, their minds struggling to accept what they were witnessing. After a 20-minute walk, they arrived at Haven. The fortified settlement sprawled across the cliff face, with structures built from salvaged metal and local stone. Solar collectors gleamed in the harsh sunlight. Water collection systems fed into storage tanks. Gardens grew in protected areas. Smoke rose from cooking fires. And everywhere, humans moved with purpose and confidence, going about their daily tasks. Fricks's legs seemed to give out, and he sat down hard on a rock, staring at the settlement in disbelief. The other Coalition officers were equally stunned, their faces showing a mixture of shock and fear. This was not possible. Deathworlds did not get colonized. Species sent to Corvax 9 died quickly and quietly. That was the entire point. Jake walked out to meet them. He had cleaned up for the occasion, wearing clothes that had been carefully maintained despite the months of hard living. He looked healthy, strong, and completely in control. He greeted Fricks formally, introducing himself as Commander Jake Bennett of the human colony on Corvax 9. The word colony was deliberate, a declaration that this was not just survival but something permanent. Before Fricks could respond, Jake played the recording. The same transmission they had intercepted 14 months ago, the Coalition discussion about sending humans to die on Corvax 9. Fricks's face went from gray to almost white as he listened to his own people's voices coldly planning genocide by proxy. When the recording ended, Jake let the silence stretch for a long moment. Jake spoke clearly and calmly. He told Fricks that they knew everything. They knew about the betrayal, the lies, the deliberate attempt to wipe them out. He showed them evidence they had collected, documents Amy had compiled, recordings Lisa had enhanced. Everything was organized and ready to be broadcast across the galaxy if necessary. Then Jake made his offer. The Coalition could do the right thing. They could acknowledge what they had done, provide transport for the humans back to Earth, and allow humanity to leave the Coalition with their dignity intact. Or Jake would broadcast everything to every species, every news network, every political body in known space. The Coalition's reputation would be destroyed, and humanity would make sure everyone knew that the supposed alliance was nothing more than a group of cowards who murdered those they feared. Fricks tried to argue. He claimed Jake was bluffing, that humans lacked the capability to broadcast anything from Corvax 9. Lisa chose that moment to demonstrate. From her workshop in Haven, she activated the communication systems and hijacked the Coalition ship's own transmitters. Within seconds, she was broadcasting a message to all Coalition frequencies, using their own ships as amplifiers. The message was simple and devastating. It contained the original recording of the Coalition planning the human extinction. It showed images of Haven and the thriving human settlement. It included testimony from Jake explaining exactly what had been done to them, and it ended with a challenge to the Coalition to explain their actions to the entire galaxy. Fricks collapsed completely, his head in his hands. He understood immediately what this meant. The broadcast was already spreading through Coalition space, being picked up by news networks and political offices. Within hours, every species in the Alliance would know what had been done. The political fallout would be enormous. Chris and his team kept the Coalition landing party under guard while they waited for a response from the ships in orbit. It did not take long. Within an hour, they received a direct communication from the Coalition High Council. The message was terse and carefully worded, but its meaning was clear. They were willing to negotiate. Over the next 3 days, Jake conducted talks with coalition representatives via video link. The conversations were tense and often hostile. Some coalition members tried to deny everything, claiming the recording was fabricated. Others attempted to justify their actions by arguing that humanity was indeed a threat. A few species were genuinely horrified when they learned the truth and demanded accountability. The galaxy's reaction was stronger than anyone expected. Independent news networks picked up the story and ran with it. Several coalition member species began calling for investigations and reforms. Public opinion turned sharply against the leadership that had authorized the plan. Protests erupted on multiple worlds. The political crisis threatened to tear the coalition apart. Finally, after intense internal debate, the Coalition High Council made their offer. They would provide immediate transport for all human survivors back to Earth. They would issue a formal apology for what had been done. They would provide reparations to humanity, but in exchange, they wanted the humans to agree not to release any additional information and to avoid inflaming the situation further. Jake called a meeting with his crew to discuss the offer. The debate was intense. Some wanted to accept and finally go home. Others wanted to reject it and continue exposing the coalition's crimes. A few suggested staying on Korvax 9 and building their colony independently. Everyone had strong opinions about what humanity should do next. In the end, Jake made the decision he thought was right. They would accept transport home, but they would not be silent. They would not release new information, but they would continue telling their story to anyone who would listen. The truth was already out there. The coalition could not bury it now, no matter how much they might want to. 3 weeks later, a coalition transport ship arrived in orbit, sent specifically to retrieve the human survivors. As Jake prepared to leave Korvax 9, he took one last walk through Haven. They had built something remarkable here, a settlement that proved humans could thrive even in the most hostile conditions. He felt a strange sadness about leaving it behind, even though he desperately wanted to see Earth again. Before boarding the shuttle, Jake placed a marker at the entrance to Haven. It was a simple metal plaque that Lisa had fabricated, engraved with the names of all 30 people who had started this journey, and the 11 who had died making survival possible. Below the names was a short inscription that Jake had. The journey back to Earth took 3 months aboard the Coalition transport vessel Star Runner. The ship was large and comfortable, designed for diplomatic missions with luxurious quarters that seemed absurd to people who had spent over a year living in caves and makeshift shelters. The human survivors moved through the pristine corridors like ghosts, unable to fully adjust to the sudden change from survival mode to civilized comfort. The Coalition crew treated them with careful respect, mixed with obvious fear. Word had spread about what the humans had accomplished on Korvax 9. The crew members gave the survivors wide berth, speaking in hushed tones when they thought the humans were not listening. Jake found their reaction both satisfying and sad. They had been betrayed because they were viewed as a threat, and now that fear had only intensified. Jake used the journey time to organize his thoughts and help his crew prepare for what was coming. They would not return to Earth as victims seeking sympathy. They would arrive as victors who had overcome impossible odds. That narrative was important, not just for humanity's reputation, but for the survivors' own mental health. They needed to frame their experience as a triumph rather than a tragedy. Amy spent the voyage writing detailed reports about everything they had learned on Korvax 9. Her documentation covered the planet's ecology, the adaptation techniques they had developed, the genetic modifications that had allowed them to process native food. She worked obsessively, often through the night, creating a comprehensive guide that could help future colonists survive hostile environments. Her work was driven by a simple belief that their suffering should serve a purpose beyond just their own survival. Chris compiled tactical analyses of every combat encounter they had experienced. He documented the predator species, their hunting patterns, their weaknesses. He wrote training manuals for fighting in extreme environments. He created strategic recommendations for defending colonies against hostile wildlife. Like Amy, he wanted to ensure that other humans could benefit from the brutal lessons they had learned. Lisa focused on technical documentation. She created detailed schematics showing how they had built Haven's infrastructure from almost nothing. She wrote guides on salvaging and repurposing ship components, She documented her communication systems and power generation solutions. Her goal was to create a blueprint that could help any stranded group of humans survive and eventually thrive. As they approached Earth's solar system, Jake received a communication from United Earth Command. The military and political leadership wanted to meet with him immediately upon arrival. They had questions about what happened, about the Coalition's actions, about humanity's future relationship with alien species. The message was formal and bureaucratic, but Jake could read the underlying tension. Earth was scared and angry, uncertain about how to respond to this betrayal. The Star Runner entered Earth orbit on a clear morning. Jake stood at a viewport, looking down at the blue planet he had not seen in nearly 2 years. It looked exactly the same as when he left, but he knew he was completely different. The man who had departed Earth as a colonial service commander no longer existed. That person had died on Korvax 9, replaced by someone harder and more capable, someone who had learned that survival required constant vigilance and adaptability. They landed at the military spaceport in Colorado, where a massive crowd had gathered despite security efforts to keep the arrival quiet. News of their return had leaked, and thousands of people wanted to see the survivors who had defied death on an alien Deathworld. Jake could see signs and banners welcoming them home, celebrating their survival. The outpouring of support was overwhelming. The reunion with families was emotional and difficult. 14 months was a long time to be declared dead, and many of the survivors found that their lives on Earth had moved on without them. Some marriages had dissolved. Jobs had been filled by others. Children had been told their parents were never coming home. The joy of reunion was mixed with the pain of realizing how much had been lost. Jake's own family had held out hope longer than most. His sister Rachel had refused to believe he was dead, organizing pressure campaigns to demand that Earth send a rescue mission. She threw her arms around him and sobbed when they finally reunited, telling him she knew he was too stubborn to die on some alien planet. Jake held her tight, grateful for her faith even when he had almost lost his own. After 2 weeks of medical examinations and debriefings, Jake was called to address the United Earth Assembly. The massive chamber was packed with representatives from every nation and region, all wanting to hear directly from the man who had led the survivors. Jake had prepared his speech carefully, knowing that what he said today would shape humanity's response to the Coalition's betrayal. He began by laying out the facts. He played the recording of the Coalition discussion about sending humans to die. He showed images of Korvax 9 and explained exactly how hostile the environment was. He described the deaths they had suffered and the struggles they had endured. He made sure the assembly understood that this was not an accident or a miscommunication. It was a deliberate attempt to eliminate humans because the Coalition feared what humanity might become. Then Jake shifted his tone. He talked about what the survivors had accomplished. He explained how they had adapted to Korvax 9, mastered its challenges, and built a thriving settlement. He made it clear that humans had proven themselves capable of surviving anywhere, of thriving in conditions that would kill most other species. The Coalition had been right to fear humanity, but not for the reasons they thought. Humans were not dangerous because they were aggressive. They were dangerous because they refused to give up, even when giving up was the logical choice. Jake concluded his speech with a recommendation. Earth should immediately withdraw from the Galactic Coalition. Humanity needed to develop its own space capabilities, its own colonies, its own destiny. They could not trust an alliance that had already proven willing to murder them. From this point forward, humans would stand alone in the galaxy until they could find or create partnerships based on genuine respect rather than fear. The assembly erupted in debate after his speech. Some representatives agreed completely and called for immediate withdrawal. Others argued for caution, warning that isolation could be as dangerous as the Coalition. Still others suggested a middle path, maintaining minimal contact while building independent capabilities. The arguments continued for weeks, but the overall direction was clear. Humanity would never again place its fate in alien hands. As the political process ground forward, Jake and his crew became celebrities. They were invited to speak at universities, military academies, and public gatherings. Their story captured the imagination of people around the world, becoming a symbol of human resilience and determination. The phrase, "They sent us here to die, we chose to live instead," appeared on posters, clothing, and became a popular motto. But fame was uncomfortable for most of the survivors. They had not endured Korvax 9 to become public figures. They just wanted to rebuild their lives and find some measure of peace. Jake did his best to shield his crew from the worst of the attention, but it was difficult. Everyone wanted a piece of their story, wanted to use their survival for political or commercial purposes. 6 months after their return, Jake was promoted to admiral and given command of Earth's new independent space exploration program. The program's mission was to establish human colonies without coalition support or interference. Amy was appointed as the program's chief science advisor. Chris became the director of a new military academy, focused on hostile environment combat and survival. Lisa led the engineering division, designing next-generation colony ships. Most of the other survivors took positions within the space program or related organizations. Their experience was too valuable to waste, and they were the only humans who truly understood what it took to survive on a hostile alien world. They became the foundation of Earth's independent space expansion, training new generations of colonists and explorers. 2 years after returning from Korvax 9, Jake stood before a memorial built to honor the 11 crew members who had died during their ordeal. The memorial was constructed from stone brought back from Korvax 9 itself, dark rock that had been part of the cliff face where Haven was built. Each name was carved deeply into the stone, along with a brief description of how each person had contributed to the group's survival. Jake touched the names gently, remembering each person. Danny Carter, killed by a predator in the second week. The 2 who died in the crash, whose sacrifice had shown them how dangerous their situation was. The others who fell to infection, accidents, or the countless dangers that Korvax 9 had thrown at them. Each death had hurt, but each had also taught the survivors something crucial about how to stay alive. As he stood there, Rachel joined him. She had been offered a position in the space program's public relations division and had accepted, wanting to help tell humanity's story to the galaxy. She stood beside her brother in silence for a moment before speaking. "They tried to erase you," she said quietly. "The Coalition thought they could make humanity disappear by sending you to die on that planet. Instead, they made you into legends. Everyone in the galaxy knows what you accomplished now. You've become proof." 5 years after returning from Korvax 9, Admiral Jake Bennett stood on the observation deck of the colony ship New Dawn, watching as the familiar green and blue planet grew larger in the viewport. They were returning to Korvax 9, but this time as colonists by choice rather than victims of betrayal. The mission included 200 volunteers, engineers, scientists, families with children, all willing to build their lives on the Deathworld that had nearly killed the original survivors. The decision to establish a permanent colony on Korvax 9 had been controversial. Many people on Earth questioned why anyone would voluntarily move to such a dangerous world when safer planets were available, but Jake understood something that the skeptics did not. Korvax 9 had become more than just a planet. It was a symbol of everything humanity had overcome, proof that they could thrive anywhere. Abandoning it would feel like admitting that their survival there had been just luck rather than human capability. Amy stood beside him, now serving as the colony's chief science officer. She had spent the past 5 years developing advanced adaptation techniques based on what they had learned during their original ordeal. The new colonists would not have to endure the same desperate struggles. They would arrive with proper equipment, tested survival protocols, and genetic modifications that would allow them to process local food from day one. What had taken the original survivors months to develop through trial and error was now available immediately. Chris was leading the colony's security force, a team of 50 specialists trained specifically for hostile environment operations. They had studied every predator encounter from the original mission and developed tactics that turned danger into manageable risk. They brought weapons designed for Korvax 9 specific threats and armor that could withstand the temperature extremes. The new colony would not be caught unprepared like the original crew had been. Lisa had designed the New Dawn specifically for this mission. The ship carried modular habitat units that could be quickly assembled into a fortified settlement. It brought fusion generators that would provide reliable power from the start. It had advanced manufacturing equipment that could produce tools and supplies from local materials. Everything the original survivors had cobbled together from wreckage was now available as purpose-built technology. As they entered orbit, Jake opened a channel to Earth. The transmission would take several minutes to reach home, but he wanted to mark this moment officially. He spoke clearly into the recorder, his words meant for history as much as for immediate listeners. "This is Admiral Jake Bennett of the colony ship New Dawn. We have arrived at Korvax 9 to establish New Hope Colony. 5 years ago, the Galactic Coalition sent 30 humans to this world expecting us to die. 19 of us survived and made it home. Today we return by choice, 200 strong, to claim this world as humanity's first independent colony. We come not as victims but as pioneers. We come not to merely survive but to build a future. And we come with a message for the galaxy. Humanity goes where we choose, stays where we want, and answers to no one but ourselves." The landing went smoothly. They touched down at the exact site where the Frontier Dawn had crashed 5 years earlier. The wreckage was still there, now weathered by time and elements but preserved as a historical monument. Jake walked through the twisted metal with a strange feeling of nostalgia, remembering the terror of that first night and the desperate weeks that followed. Haven still stood, though nature had begun reclaiming parts of it. The cliff settlement looked smaller than Jake remembered, more fragile. But it had served its purpose, keeping 19 people alive long enough to master the planet. Now it would become part of the new colony's historical district, a reminder of where everything started. The colonists worked with impressive efficiency. Within 3 days, they had established a temporary settlement with full life support and defenses. Within 2 weeks, they had cleared land for agriculture and begun construction on permanent structures. Within a month, New Hope was a functioning town with a population that had already grown to 215, as several supply ships arrived with additional volunteers. Jake spent most of his time overseeing the colony's development, but he made sure to visit the memorial at Haven regularly. The stone marker with the 11 names still stood, though it had been damaged by weather and needed careful restoration. He organized a work party to repair it and expand the memorial to include detailed plaques explaining what had happened here and why it mattered. 6 months after the colony's founding, Jake received an unexpected communication. It was from Vrix, the coalition officer who had led the landing party that discovered the original survivors. He requested permission to visit New Hope and speak with Jake privately. After consulting with Chris and Amy, Jake agreed to the meeting, curious about what Vrix wanted after all this time. Vrix arrived on a small diplomatic shuttle, looking older and more worn than Jake remembered. The Thelani officer was nervous, clearly uncomfortable as he stepped onto the planet that had become humanity's proud symbol. Jake met him at the landing pad, flanked by 2 security officers but showing no hostility. They walked together to a viewing platform that overlooked New Hope. The colony sprawled across the landscape, with permanent buildings, agricultural zones, and busy streets filled with humans going about their daily lives. It was a stark contrast to the desperate camp Vrix had seen 5 years ago. Vrix was quiet for a long time before speaking. When he finally did, his voice was heavy with regret. He explained that he had not known about the plan to eliminate humans. He had been told it was a routine colonial mission that had failed due to technical problems. Learning the truth had shaken him deeply, leading him to question everything about the coalition he had served his entire life. He had spent the past 5 years pushing for reforms within the coalition, trying to prevent anything like the human genocide from happening again. It had been difficult and often frustrating work. Many coalition members still viewed humanity as a dangerous threat, especially after Earth's withdrawal and rapid independent expansion. But a growing minority was beginning to question the Alliance's methods and ethics. Vrix told Jake that he had come to Korvax 9 to see for himself what humans had built. He wanted to understand how a species that the coalition had tried to erase had not only survived but was now thriving. He wanted to take that understanding back to those who might be willing to listen. Jake listened carefully, then led Vrix on a tour of New Hope. He showed him the agricultural systems that produced food from local and imported plants. He demonstrated the defensive measures that kept predators at bay without requiring constant vigilance. He introduced Vrix to colonists who had chosen to build their lives here, including families with children playing in parks that would have been inconceivable 5 years ago. At the end of the tour, Jake took Vrix to the memorial at Haven. They stood before the names of the 11 who had died, and Jake explained who each person had been and how they had contributed to the group's survival. He made sure Vrix understood that these deaths were not just statistics but real people with families, dreams, and futures that had been stolen by the Coalition's fear. "I cannot forgive what was done to us," Jake said quietly. "Those 11 people should be alive today. My crew should never have been put through what we endured. But I can acknowledge that individuals like you are trying to make things better. That matters." Vrix nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Finally, he asked Jake what humanity wanted from the galaxy. What would it take for humans to consider rejoining the Coalition or forming new alliances? Jake thought carefully before answering. "We want what anyone wants," Jake said. "Respect. The right to exist without constantly proving we deserve to. The freedom to grow and explore without someone deciding we are too dangerous to be allowed to succeed. We do not need to be part of the Coalition. We will build our own path. But if your alliance can learn to see us as equals rather than threats, maybe there can be cooperation in the future. Not now. The wounds are too fresh, but someday." Vrix left Korvax 9 that evening with a data package that Jake had prepared. It contained detailed documentation of everything the colony had achieved, testimonies from colonists about why they had chosen to live here, and proposals for how humanity and the Coalition might eventually rebuild trust. Jake had no illusions that it would change everything overnight, but it was a start. Years passed. New Hope grew from a small colony to a thriving city of over 10,000 people. Additional settlements were established across Korvax 9, each one expanding humanity's presence on the Deathworld. The planet that was supposed to be their grave had become a cornerstone of human expansion into space. Proof that no environment was too harsh, no challenge too great. Other human colonies followed, spreading across systems that Earth had claimed independently. Some were on garden worlds with perfect conditions. Others were on challenging planets that required adaptation and innovation. But it was Korvax 9 that remained special, the symbol of human resilience that inspired every new colonial effort. The galaxy's view of humanity slowly began to shift. The Coalition's attempt to quietly eliminate humans had backfired so spectacularly that it had become a cautionary tale throughout known.